I never told my mother-in-law I used to prosecute military crimes. She laughed when I walked into court alone, telling me I was finished. That is, until the judge looked down from the bench and said, "Good morning, Colonel." My mother-in-law froze, completely unable to comprehend the words. But before we get to that glorious moment in the courtroom, let me tell you how this entire nightmare began. My name is Zora. I am 34 years old, and for 5 years I played the role of a quiet, unassuming legal secretary to keep the peace in my marriage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And if you have ever had family betray your trust, hit subscribe. Growing up, my parents instilled in me the value of quiet strength and public service. I joined the military right out of law school, serving in the Judge Advocate General Corps. I spent my 20s prosecuting high-level military contractors for fraud and treason. It was a dangerous, high-stakes life. When I met Marcus, I was ready for a change. I wanted a quiet life in Atlanta. I took a job as a paralegal at a small firm, keeping my military past and my substantial savings a secret. Marcus was charming, the CEO of a growing medical supply company, and he loved playing the role of the provider. I let him. I thought I was nurturing his ego, but I was actually feeding a monster. The true nature of his family was on full display that Saturday evening. We were attending a highly exclusive charity gala at a country club in Buckhead. The room was filled with Atlanta elite, a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone and status was everything. My mother-in-law, Beatrice Washington, considered herself the absolute queen of the social circle. She was a former sorority president, the head of the church committee, and a woman who believed that coming from old money made her inherently superior to everyone else. She had never approved of me. In her eyes, because I did not come from a prominent family with a recognized last name, I was beneath them. I was just a girl who went to a public university, not a prestigious, historically black college like Spelman or Howard, where the Washingtons had established their academic legacy for generations. I was sitting alone at our table. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the crystal glasses and heavy silver cutlery. I was halfway through a plate of oysters, waiting for Marcus, who had vanished to the bar half an hour earlier. I assumed he was networking as he always did. I did not realize he was hiding. The soft hum of polite conversation was violently interrupted when a thick manila envelope was slammed down directly onto my plate. The impact was so forceful that ice and oyster shells shattered, scattering across the pristine white tablecloth and splashing cold water onto the bodice of my black silk dress. I looked up slowly. Beatrice towered over me, wearing a custom emerald gown that probably cost more than my first car. Her face was twisted into a sneer of pure triumph. "Sign it, Zora," she commanded. Her voice was not a shout, but it was perfectly pitched to carry to the neighboring tables. Conversations around us stopped abruptly. I could feel the eyes of dozens of society wives turning in our direction, eager to witness a scandal unfold in real time. $50,000 is more than generous for 5 years of freeloading off my son. Beatrice continued, making sure her friends at the next table could hear every single word. Marcus is about to take his medical supply company public. A low-level legal clerk like you simply does not fit the corporate image anymore. We need someone who knows how to behave in polite society, not a charity case. I looked down at the ruined plate. The bold letters on the document read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The expensive paper was already soaking up the melted ice and oyster brine. For a fleeting second, I felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. It was the exact same feeling I used to get right before stepping into a military tribunal to dismantle a corrupt general. But my training took over immediately. I kept my breathing even and my face completely impassive. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I reached for my linen napkin and methodically wiped a drop of water from my wrist. My calmness seemed to infuriate her. Beatrice leaned in closer, planting her manicured hands firmly on the table. "We both know you never belonged here," she hissed, dropping the theatrical volume for a venomous whisper meant only for me. "You are a public school, nobody from the wrong side of the tracks who hit the jackpot by trapping my son." The Washington family has a legacy of excellence. We are doctors, we are politicians, we are board members. We do not drag our bloodline through the mud with someone who buys off the rack clothing and works as a glorified typist. I picked up the damp document, letting the water drip onto the expensive carpet. I flipped to the asset division section, ignoring her tirade. I wanted to see exactly how greedy they were being. And do not even think about contesting the asset division, Beatrice warned, stepping back and crossing her arms. The postnuptial agreement is airtight. You will waive all rights to the primary residence, the investment accounts, and you will sign over the administration rights to that little Howard University scholarship fund you set up in your maiden name. That money came from Marcus, and it belongs back in the Washington Family Trust. That was the exact moment she sealed her own fate. That scholarship fund had absolutely nothing to do with Marcus. I had established it in honor of my late father, and I had funded it entirely with my own combat pay and savings from my deployments overseas. It was my money, my father's name, and my legacy. The sheer audacity of her demanding it crossed a line she did not even know existed. She thought she was bullying a meek, uneducated civilian who would wither under the pressure of public humiliation. She had no idea she had just declared war on a former judge advocate general corps prosecutor who specialized in taking down international fraud rings. Beatrice stood there waiting for the tears she was so certain would come. She wanted me to break down, to cause a massive scene, to give her the perfect excuse to have the country club security escort the hysterical, uncultured daughter-in-law off the premises. Instead, I reached for the heavy silver steak knife resting next to my plate. Beatrice took a slight step back, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second in alarm. I did not raise the knife toward her. With a swift, precise, and powerful motion, I drove the blade straight down through the center of the divorce papers, pinning the thick stack of documents directly to the solid oak table beneath the linen. The sharp thud echoed through the silent dining room, cutting through the jazz music like a gunshot. I stood up smoothly, adjusting the skirt of my dress, completely ignoring the shocked gasps from the nearby tables. "You really should advise Marcus to hire better legal counsel," Beatrice, I said. My voice was steady and cold enough to freeze the room. I tapped the hilt of the knife, which was still quivering slightly in the wood. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of this garbage attempts to claim a charitable trust as a marital asset. Not only is that a fundamental violation of federal tax codes regarding nonprofit entities, but trying to compel my signature to transfer it under threat of an inequitable divorce settlement constitutes financial extortion. I leaned in so only she could hear my next words, matching her earlier venomous tone. "Tell your son that if he wants a divorce, he can hand me the papers himself, like a man, rather than hiding at the bar and sending his mother to do his dirty work." "And Beatrice," I smiled pleasantly, "the next time you try to steal money bearing my father's name, I will make sure the Internal Revenue Service takes a very close look at exactly how your church building fund paid for your new Mercedes." Beatrice stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her heavy makeup looking like a harsh mask. The absolute silence in the country club dining room was suddenly shattered by a loud, arrogant scoff. A hand slammed down onto the table, rattling the crystal glasses. It was Bryce Chloe's white husband, projecting the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of failing upward on Wall Street. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, leaning over the table to intrude on my personal space, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully, Zora," Bryce sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You are way out of your depth here. You are throwing around wild accusations because you are emotional, but this is the real world. We are talking about fiduciary obligations, equitable distribution, and irrevocable waivers. You are a paralegal. You file paperwork for a living. You do not understand how high-level corporate asset division works." He pointed a manicured finger at the divorce papers still pinned to the table by the steak knife. "I highly suggest you pull that knife out of the wood, pick up a pen, and sign your name right now. My lawyer drew up those papers and he charges $800 an hour. Do not waste the time of people who actually know how to generate real wealth. I did not flinch. I did not move back. I simply looked at his pointing finger, then slowly brought my gaze up to meet his pale, arrogant eyes. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds, watching the false bravado start to crack at the edges of his smile. $800 an hour is a steep price to pay for a lawyer who clearly does not know how to cover your tracks, Bryce, I said, my voice completely level, completely devoid of the hysteria he was expecting. I watched his eyes narrow in confusion. If I were you, I would be less concerned about my marital assets and much more concerned about the Delaware shell company you registered last October under the name Apex Holdings LLC. The same shell company you have been using to funnel unreported capital gains from your real estate firm to avoid federal taxation. Bryce physically recoiled, the smug smirk instantly vanishing from his face. His jaw dropped. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a surgical, precise whisper. Tax identification number ending in 4927. You have moved exactly $3.2 million through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands over the last 14 months. That is not just a civil penalty, Bryce. That is federal wire fraud and tax evasion. If you ever speak to me in that tone of voice again, I will personally ensure that your $800 an hour lawyer is visiting you behind the glass of a federal penitentiary. Bryce turned a sickly shade of gray. He stepped back, bumping into the chair behind him, entirely stripped of his arrogant armor. He looked at Beatrice, panic flashing across his face, completely unable to comprehend how the quiet, submissive woman he had mocked for 5 years possessed his most guarded financial secrets. Before anyone could process the absolute destruction of Bryce's ego, a shadow fell over the table. Chloe, my sister-in-law, who had been standing silently by her husband's side, suddenly let out a screech of pure, unfiltered rage. Unable to handle her husband being humiliated and her family's dominance being challenged, she grabbed her full glass of expensive Cabernet and hurled the contents directly at me. The dark red wine splashed violently across my chest, soaking into the delicate silk of my black dress and dripping down my neck. The cold liquid sent a shock through my system, but my military discipline held firm. I did not scream. I did not wipe my face. I simply closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, took a measured breath, and opened them again, projecting an aura of lethal calm. Right at that very moment, a voice cut through the tension. What is going on here? It was Marcus, my husband, the man I had spent 5 years playing small for just so he could feel big. He walked up to the table, taking in the scene, the shattered oyster shells, the knife embedded in the divorce papers, Bryce looking terrified, Beatrice clutching her chest in feigned distress, and me standing there dripping in red wine. For one brief, foolish second, the civilian part of my heart hoped he would ask if I was all right. I hoped he would demand to know why his sister had thrown a drink in my face. Instead, Marcus looked at my stained dress with an expression of profound disgust. Look at you, Marcus spat, shaking his head. You are making an absolute spectacle of yourself. This is exactly why my mother said you were a mistake. You have no class, Zora. You do not know how to conduct yourself in polite society. I stared at him, the last remaining shred of my affection for this man evaporating into the cold air of the dining room. Your sister assaults me, and I am the one lacking class, I asked, my voice dangerously soft. You provoked them, Marcus shot back, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with his mother and his cowardly brother-in-law. He puffed out his chest, trying to project authority. It is over, Zora. I am done apologizing for you. I am done dragging a glorified paralegal to corporate events and hoping you do not embarrass me. I am securing a massive government contract next week to supply medical equipment to the Department of Defense. I am about to take my company to a level you cannot even comprehend. I need a wife who belongs in my world, not someone who acts like a street thug at a country club. He pulled his phone from his pocket, waving it at me. Do not bother trying to use the platinum card to pay for an Uber home. I transferred every single cent out of our joint accounts this morning. I canceled your credit cards. You have absolutely nothing. You are going to sign those papers, you are going to walk away quietly. And you are going to be grateful I do not sue you for the emotional distress you have caused this family. Marcus stood there waiting for me to shatter. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to panic over the frozen bank accounts and the loss of his precious financial protection. He wanted to see the helpless dependent woman he thought he had married. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of liberation. The charade was finally over. I did not have to pretend to be weak anymore. I did not have to smile at these parasites. I slowly reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my phone. I ignored Marcus completely. I ignored the triumphant sneer returning to Beatrice's face. I opened a highly encrypted secure messaging application that I had not used for personal matters in 5 years. I typed a single brief message to a classified contact number at the Pentagon. Activate Alpha Contract Freeze. I hit send. I slid the phone back into my purse, picked up my coat, and looked Marcus dead in the eye. You are absolutely right, Marcus. I said, my voice echoing with a chilling authority that made him involuntarily take a step back. I do not belong in your world. Your world is incredibly small, entirely fragile, and about to collapse. Enjoy your evening. I turned my back on the Washington family and walked out of the dining room. I moved with the precise, measured stride of a commanding officer leaving a conquered battlefield. I did not look back at the whispers of the other guests. I did not look back at the mess on the table. The night air outside the country club was crisp and cool against my wine-soaked dress. I walked to my car, a modest sedan I had bought myself long before I met Marcus, and drove away from the rolling green hills of Buckhead. My mind was operating with absolute clarity, processing the tactical variables of the war that had just been declared. When I finally turned into the driveway of the sprawling brick mansion Marcus and I had shared for 5 years, the reality of his petty cruelty was sitting right on the front porch. 3 heavy trash bags were dumped haphazardly on the concrete steps. My clothes, my shoes, my personal items, all carelessly shoved into plastic garbage bags, like discarded waste. I walked up the steps and tried the heavy brass door handle. It was locked. I punched my code into the digital keypad. The small screen flashed red, displaying an error message, indicating the access code had been deleted. Marcus had indeed locked me out of my own home. My phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID flashed with Beatrice's number. I answered it, putting the phone to my ear as I stared at the locked door. I hope you like the view from the street. Beatrice's voice crackled through the speaker, heavy with malicious glee. Marcus changed the locks the moment you left for the club this evening. You have no money, no home, and no family to run back to. You can take your garbage bags and go find a bridge to sleep under. This is what happens when you disrespect your betters, Zora. You end up with exactly what you started with. Nothing. I did not scream. I did not demand to be let in. I looked down at the trash bags at my feet. You are going to need a much bigger house to hide in, Beatrice, I replied evenly, and ended the call. I casually kicked the nearest trash bag off the porch, watching it tumble into the manicured bushes. I did not need anything in those bags. The woman who wore those clothes was dead. Headlights swept across the dark driveway. A massive jet-black Chevrolet Suburban with heavily tinted windows and federal government license plates rolled silently to a stop right behind my sedan. The doors opened simultaneously. 2 men wearing sharp, dark suits and earpieces stepped out onto the driveway. Their posture was rigid, their movements highly coordinated. They walked up the driveway, stopping at the base of the porch steps. They did not look at the trash bags. They did not look at the locked door of the mansion. They looked entirely and respectfully at me. The taller of the 2 agents straightened his posture and gave a crisp, formal nod. Colonel, he said, his voice carrying the distinct, respectful tone of a subordinate addressing a superior officer. The Situation Room is ready. Your clearance has been fully reinstated. I looked at the locked door of Marcus's house one last time, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the waiting federal vehicle. Let us go to work, I said. The cold red wine dripped from my chin and soaked into the silk of my dress, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. The sharp scent of alcohol filled my nose, masking the expensive perfumes of the country club elite who were watching this spectacle unfold. I stood completely still, my chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. I did not wipe my face. I did not yell at Chloe for throwing the drink. My eyes were fixed on the archway of the dining room, because right at that moment, Marcus walked in. My husband of 5 years, the man I had built a quiet life for, the man who promised to protect me, was finally here. For a fraction of a second, my heart allowed itself a foolish civilian hope. I expected him to rush forward. I expected him to demand why his sister had just assaulted his wife in front of half of Atlanta. I expected him to be furious. But the world seemed to slow down, narrowing my focus entirely onto his expression. As Marcus took in the scene, the shattered oyster shells, the divorce papers pinned to the table, the terrified look on his brother-in-law, Bryce and me standing there dripping in wine, his handsome face did not register shock or anger. It registered profound disgust. He did not rush to my side. He did not ask if I was hurt. He adjusted the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo and walked deliberately toward his family. He bypassed me completely, leaving a wide berth as if my public humiliation was a contagious disease. He took his place right beside his mother Beatrice and his sister Chloe, forming a unified solid wall of Washington family legacy. I was on the outside. I had always been on the outside. "Look at yourself," Zora Marcus said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. It was not a shout, but a cold, disappointed reprimand, like a parent scolding an unruly child. "You are making an absolute spectacle of yourself. This is exactly what my mother warned me about. You simply do not know how to conduct yourself in polite society." I stared at him, the last remaining shred of my affection for this man evaporating into the chilled air of the country club. "Your sister just threw a glass of wine in my face," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "And I am the one lacking class." "You provoked them," Marcus shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. "You always have to push things too far. I asked my mother to hand you those papers quietly to avoid exactly this kind of scene. I wanted to handle this with dignity, but you just had to be difficult. You just had to try and drag my family down to your level. I am done apologizing for you, Zora. I am done dragging a glorified legal secretary to corporate events and holding my breath hoping you do not embarrass me." He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to project authority. The charm that had won me over 5 years ago was completely gone, replaced by the arrogant entitlement he had inherited from his mother. "I wanted to make this easy for you, but since you want to act like an ungrateful wretch who forgot where she came from, let me make things perfectly clear. The marriage is over. And before you even think about hiring some discount lawyer to come after my assets, you should know that I have already taken care of everything." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen with a smug smile. "I went to the bank this morning while you were getting ready for this gala. I transferred every single cent out of our joint checking and savings accounts. The money is safe in an offshore family trust that you cannot touch. I also canceled all of your credit cards. You have absolutely nothing, Zora. Not a dime. You are going to sign those divorce papers, you are going to waive any claim to alimony, and you are going to walk away quietly. If you fight me, I will drag this out in court until you are buried so deep in legal fees, you will be begging for a public defender." The cruelty in his voice was absolute. He stood there waiting for me to shatter. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to panic over the frozen bank accounts and the sudden terrifying loss of his financial protection. He wanted to see the helpless, dependent woman he thought he had married break down in tears and surrender to his demands. He thought taking away my access to his money would leave me powerless. He did not know that his wealth was nothing compared to the combat pay and military pensions I had been quietly investing for years. He did not know that I had never needed him to provide for me. "Marcus, you drained our accounts to punish me," I asked, tilting my head slightly. "I drained them to protect my future," he corrected smoothly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "You see, Zora, my company Alpha Defense Solutions is no longer just a small medical supplier. We just secured a massive multi-million-dollar government contract with the Department of Defense. I am about to become a major player in federal contracting. I am taking this company to a level you cannot even begin to comprehend. I am going to be sitting at tables with generals and politicians. I need a wife who belongs in that world. I need someone who understands corporate politics, legacy, and wealth. Not a public school nobody who files paperwork for a living. You served your purpose, Zora, but you are obsolete. Hearing him brag about his defense contract, the very contract I knew was built on the fraudulent medical supplies his brother-in-law Bryce was smuggling into the country, was the final push I needed. The wounded wife was gone. The quiet, submissive paralegal was dead. In her place stood the former Judge Advocate General Corps prosecutor, the woman who had spent her 20s dismantling international fraud rings and putting corrupt military contractors behind federal bars. I felt a deep, profound sense of liberation. The charade was finally over. I did not have to pretend to be weak anymore. I did not have to smile at these parasites or swallow my pride to keep the peace. I slowly reached into my small clutch purse. Marcus laughed a harsh, mocking sound. "What are you doing, Zora? Trying to call a cab. Do not bother trying to use the platinum card for an Uber. I told you it is declined. You might have to walk back to whatever cheap apartment you plan on renting." I ignored him completely. I pulled out my phone, keeping my face completely impassive. I did not open my banking app. I did not open my contacts to call a lawyer. I opened a highly encrypted, secure messaging application that I had not used for professional matters in 5 years. The interface was stark black and green, requiring a double biometric authentication to access. My thumb pressed against the scanner, and the app opened immediately, linking directly to a classified server at the Pentagon. I typed a single brief message to the director of the Defense Contract Auditing Agency, a man who still owed me his career. Activate Alpha Contract Freeze. I hit send. I watched the delivery confirmation flash on the screen, ensuring the message was received and encrypted. By tomorrow morning, Marcus would find out that his multi-million-dollar government contract was suspended, pending a full federal investigation. By tomorrow, his entire corporate empire would begin to crumble under the weight of a military audit. He thought he was locking me out of his bank accounts, but I had just locked him out of his entire future. I slid the phone back into my purse and snapped it shut. I looked up, meeting Marcus's arrogant gaze. The country club dining room was still dead silent, everyone waiting for my reaction. I did not give them the satisfaction of a scene. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp smile that made the hairs on the back of Marcus's neck stand up. He took an involuntary step back, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second as he looked into my eyes and saw something he did not recognize, something dangerous. "You are absolutely right, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling authority that commanded the room. "I do not belong in your world. Your world is incredibly small, entirely fragile, and built on a foundation of lies. Enjoy your new contract. Let us see how long it lasts." I turned my back on the Washington family and walked out of the dining room, moving with the precise, measured stride of a commanding officer leaving a conquered battlefield. The heavy armored door of the SUV closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me inside a mobile command center and instantly severing me from the civilian world I had inhabited for 5 years. The ambient noise of the affluent Atlanta suburb vanished, replaced by the low, powerful hum of the reinforced engine and the quiet, steady static of encrypted tactical radios. Agent Miller, seated across from me, handed me a secure, glowing tablet without a word, while the driver smoothly accelerated away from the curb. I watched Marcus's house disappear in the rearview mirror. The sprawling brick mansion, the manicured lawn, the life I had meticulously curated to appear harmless and ordinary, it was all shrinking into the darkness. For 5 years I had played the dutiful, quiet wife. I had attended their charity galas, smiled placidly at their condescending remarks, and filed their mundane legal paperwork. Now the camouflage was off. The encrypted tablet in my hands was already pulling up the Alpha contract files. Beatrice and Marcus thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon back to a veteran sniper. The drive to the secure federal facility took less than 20 minutes, but by the time we passed through the subterranean security gates, my civilian phone was already vibrating relentlessly. It was Beatrice. I let it ring out. She left a voicemail followed immediately by a rapid succession of text messages. The first was a photograph of my empty closet, the expensive hangers stripped completely bare. The second read, "I told the country club board about your little outburst. You are permanently banned, and just so you know, Pastor Thomas and the entire congregation at First Baptist will be hearing about your erratic, unstable behavior in the morning. We protect our own Zora. You are entirely alone." I scoffed quietly, swiping the notification away. Beatrice was executing the exact social playbook I knew she would. In her world, reputation was absolute currency, and isolation was the ultimate punishment. She was mobilizing the church committee, the country club wives, and the local elite to paint me as the hysterical, unhinged wife who had finally snapped under the pressure of her son's success. She was laying the groundwork for a massive coordinated smear campaign. Within hours, the narrative would be perfectly spun and distributed. Marcus, the successful, upstanding CEO, forced to divorce his unstable lower-class wife, who could not handle the demands of polite society. It was predictable. It was pathetic. And it was exactly what I needed her to do. The louder she screamed and gossiped, the more distracted she would be from the silent federal trap closing around her family's finances. The SUV parked in a brightly lit underground bunker beneath an unmarked concrete building in downtown Atlanta. Miller opened the door and I stepped out, my wine-stained silk dress, a stark, jarring contrast to the sterile, tactical environment. We walked through a series of complex biometric checkpoints until we reached the heavy steel doors of Situation Room 4. As the doors slid open, the atmosphere instantly shifted. The massive room was bathed in the cool blue light of dozens of high-resolution monitors. Analysts, forensic accountants, and federal investigators were already at their stations, their fingers flying across keyboards, deciphering streams of data. When I crossed the threshold, the room fell dead silent. Every single person stopped what they were doing and stood at attention. "Welcome back, Colonel Washington," Agent Vance said, stepping forward with a thick, physical dossier. "We received your activation code. The Alpha contract freeze is in full effect. Marcus's company has been officially flagged for a comprehensive Level 4 audit. We have also initiated silent, continuous surveillance on Bryce's offshore accounts." "Sit down, everyone. We have a lot of ground to cover," I said, taking my place at the head of the long glass table. I did not bother changing out of my ruined dress. The dark stain was a perfect reminder of exactly who I was dealing with. "Let us start with the immediate threat. Marcus thinks he has financially paralyzed me by freezing our joint accounts. I want a full, unredacted trace on every dollar he moved this morning. Track the routing numbers. I suspect Bryce helped him funnel it into the Apex Holdings shell company." Vance tapped his keyboard, throwing a complex web of financial transactions onto the primary viewing screen. "You are correct, Colonel. The funds were routed through 2 intermediate corporate accounts before landing in a Cayman Islands trust managed by Apex. It is a textbook evasion maneuver. But there is a secondary issue. We are tracking a sudden influx of aggressive legal filings in the Fulton County civil court system." He handed me a tablet. Marcus had not just filed for divorce. His lawyers had filed an emergency injunction demanding I be held liable for potential economic damages to his company, citing my disruptive public behavior as a direct threat to his upcoming government contract. He was actually trying to sue me for the money he claimed I was jeopardizing. Beatrice's fingerprints were all over the aggressive legal strategy. They were trying to bleed me dry through civil litigation, burying me in motions, subpoenas, and hearings, until I was forced to settle on their draconian terms just to survive. "Let them file," I instructed, my eyes scanning the digital documents with practiced efficiency. "Do not block the civil proceedings. Let Marcus rack up exorbitant billable hours with his high-priced attorneys. He is trying to win a knife fight while we are calling in an airstrike. We keep our federal investigation completely classified. To the outside world and to the Washington family, I am still just an unemployed homeless legal secretary desperately trying to find a pro bono lawyer." The hours bled into the early morning as we systematically dismantled the financial architecture of Marcus's company and Bryce's real estate firm. The sheer level of arrogance was staggering. Bryce had been using Zora Washington, the quiet military veteran, as a clean, honorable face for his shell companies to bypass federal scrutiny, assuming I would never dig into the complex corporate paperwork I was asked to sign as a paralegal. He had severely underestimated the woman he was using as a shield. I had spent years quietly gathering digital copies of every ledger, every invoice, and every questionable tax filing. Just as the sun was beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across the command center, my personal cell phone buzzed with an incoming email. The sender address was a scrambled, untraceable string of characters. The subject line was completely blank. I opened the email and my blood instantly turned to ice. It was not a gloating message from Beatrice or Marcus. It was from Bryce. He had attached a single high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of my mother. She was lying in her hospital bed at the long-term care facility in Savannah, where she was recovering from a severe stroke. The photo had been taken from the hallway looking through the small glass window of her door. It was recent. It was a clear, unmistakable threat. Below the image, a single line of text read, "Your Medicaid coverage for this facility is tied directly to Marcus's corporate health plan. Sign the divorce papers and the non-disclosure agreement by noon today, or the coverage is revoked immediately." Medical bills can be quite a heavy burden for someone without a checking account. Do not make this harder on your family than it needs to be. Bryce was not just an arrogant financial broker. He was a sociopath. He actually thought he could use my disabled mother as leverage to force me into submission. He thought a covert photograph and a cowardly financial threat would terrify me into compliance. He expected me to panic, to call him begging for mercy, to concede everything to protect the woman who had raised me. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The cold, calculating fury that washed over me was absolute and all-consuming. I looked up at the wall of monitors, then back down at Agent Vance. "Vance," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that made the seasoned investigator stand up straight. "I want a 24-hour federal protection detail stationed at Savannah Memorial Hospital immediately. No one goes near my mother's room without classified clearance. If anyone from Bryce's camp even drives past that facility, I want them detained." "Yes, Colonel, right away." "And Vance," I added, locking my phone screen and setting it face down on the glass table, "pull up Bryce's Department of Defense shipping manifests. The medical supplies he imported from overseas last month, the ones he plans to use to fulfill Marcus's massive government contract." Vance hesitated, quickly bringing up the encrypted documents on the main screen. "We have them, Colonel. They are listed as sterile surgical kits and advanced combat trauma supplies." "They are counterfeit," I stated, the pieces of the puzzle perfectly snapping into place. He bought substandard non-sterile equipment from a blacklisted manufacturer and forged the safety certifications to cut costs. He is planning to sell infected medical supplies to the United States military. The room went dead silent. The analysts stopped typing. Selling counterfeit tactical gear was a federal crime. Selling contaminated medical supplies to combat medics serving overseas was an act of profound betrayal and treason. "I want the warehouse location," I ordered, standing up from the table. "I want the import records, the forged signatures, and the exact paper trail linking Bryce's shell company directly to Marcus's CEO authorization. They thought they could threaten my family to protect their wealth. I am going to obliterate theirs." The heavy armored door of the SUV closed with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me inside a mobile command center and instantly severing me from the civilian world I had inhabited for 5 years. The ambient noise of the affluent Atlanta suburb vanished, replaced by the low, powerful hum of the reinforced engine and the quiet, steady static of encrypted tactical radios. Agent Miller, seated across from me, handed me a secure, glowing tablet without a single word, while the driver smoothly accelerated away from the curb. I watched Marcus and his sprawling brick mansion disappear in the rearview mirror. The manicured lawn, the expensive cars, the life I had meticulously curated to appear harmless and ordinary, it was all shrinking into the darkness. For 5 years I had played the dutiful, quiet wife. I had attended their charity galas, smiled placidly at their condescending remarks, and filed their mundane legal paperwork. Now the camouflage was off. The encrypted tablet in my hands was already pulling up the alpha contract files. Beatrice and Marcus thought they had left me with absolutely nothing. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon back to a veteran sniper. The drive to the secure federal facility took less than 20 minutes, but by the time we passed through the subterranean security gates, my civilian phone was already vibrating relentlessly. It was Beatrice. I let it ring out. She left a voicemail followed immediately by a rapid succession of text messages. The first was a photograph of my empty closet, the expensive hangers stripped completely bare. The second read that she had already contacted the country club board about my outburst and that I was permanently banned. She promised that Pastor Thomas and the entire congregation at First Baptist would be hearing about my erratic, unstable behavior in the morning. She told me they protect their own and that I was entirely alone. I swiped the notification away. Beatrice was executing the exact social playbook I knew she would. In her world, reputation was absolute currency, and isolation was the ultimate punishment. She was mobilizing the church committee, the country club wives, and the local elite to paint me as the hysterical, unhinged wife who had finally snapped under the pressure of her son and his massive success. She was laying the groundwork for a massive, coordinated smear campaign. Within hours, the narrative would be perfectly spun and distributed. Marcus, the successful, upstanding CEO, forced to divorce his unstable lower-class wife, who could not handle the demands of polite society. It was predictable, and it was exactly what I needed her to do. The louder she screamed and gossiped, the more distracted she would be from the silent federal trap closing around her family and their finances. The SUV parked in a brightly lit underground bunker beneath an unmarked concrete building in downtown Atlanta. Miller opened the door and I stepped out, my wine-stained silk dress, a stark, jarring contrast to the sterile, tactical environment. We walked through a series of complex biometric checkpoints until we reached the heavy steel doors of Situation Room 4. As the doors slid open, the atmosphere instantly shifted. The massive room was bathed in the cool blue light of dozens of high-resolution monitors. Analysts, forensic accountants, and federal investigators were already at their stations, their fingers flying across keyboards, deciphering streams of data. When I crossed the threshold, the room fell dead silent. Every single person stopped what they were doing and stood at attention. "Welcome back, Colonel Washington," Agent Vance said, stepping forward with a thick physical dossier. "We received your activation code. The Alpha contract freeze is in full effect. Marcus and his company have been officially flagged for a comprehensive Level 4 audit. We have also initiated silent continuous surveillance on Bryce and his offshore accounts." "Sit down, everyone. We have a lot of ground to cover," I said, taking my place at the head of the long glass table. I did not bother changing out of my ruined dress. The dark wine stain was a perfect reminder of exactly who I was dealing with. Let us start with the immediate threat. Marcus thinks he has financially paralyzed me by freezing our joint accounts. I want a full, unredacted trace on every dollar he moved this morning. Track the routing numbers. I suspect Bryce helped him funnel it into the Apex Holdings shell company. Vance tapped his keyboard, throwing a complex web of financial transactions onto the primary viewing screen. "You are correct, Colonel. The funds were routed through 2 intermediate corporate accounts before landing in a Cayman Islands trust managed by Apex. It is a textbook evasion maneuver. But there is a secondary issue. We are tracking a sudden influx of aggressive legal filings in the Fulton County Civil Court system." He handed me a tablet. Marcus had not just filed for divorce. His lawyers had filed an emergency injunction demanding I be held liable for potential economic damages to his company, citing my disruptive public behavior as a direct threat to his upcoming government contract. He was actually trying to sue me for the money he claimed I was jeopardizing. Beatrice and her fingerprints were all over the aggressive legal strategy. They were trying to bleed me dry through civil litigation, burying me in motion subpoenas and hearings until I was forced to settle on their draconian terms just to survive. "Let them file," I instructed, my eyes scanning the digital documents with practiced efficiency. "Do not block the civil proceedings. Let Marcus rack up exorbitant billable hours with his high-priced attorneys. He is trying to win a knife fight while we are calling in an airstrike. We keep our federal investigation completely classified. To the outside world and to the Washington family, I am still just an unemployed homeless legal secretary desperately trying to find a pro bono lawyer. The hours bled into the early morning as we systematically dismantled the financial architecture of Marcus and his company alongside Bryce and his real estate firm. The sheer level of arrogance was staggering. Bryce had been using Zora Washington, the quiet military veteran, as a clean, honorable face for his shell companies to bypass federal scrutiny. Assuming I would never dig into the complex corporate paperwork I was asked to sign as a paralegal. He had severely underestimated the woman he was using as a shield. I had spent years quietly gathering digital copies of every ledger, every invoice, and every questionable tax filing. I directed the analyst to cross-reference the Alpha Defense Solutions supply chain with the customs declarations Bryce had filed over the last quarter. I wanted every fraudulent medical device cataloged and traced back to its illicit manufacturer. Just as the sun was beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting long shadows across the command center, my personal cell phone buzzed with an incoming email. The sender address was a scrambled, untraceable string of characters. The subject line was completely blank. I opened the email and my blood instantly turned to ice. It was not a gloating message from Beatrice or Marcus. It was from Bryce. He had attached a single high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of my mother. She was lying in her hospital bed at the long-term care facility in Savannah, where she was recovering from a severe stroke. The photo had been taken from the hallway, looking through the small glass window of her door. It was recent. It was a clear, unmistakable threat. Below the image, a single line of text read that my Medicaid coverage for this facility was tied directly to Marcus and his corporate health plan. The message demanded that I sign the divorce papers and the non-disclosure agreement by noon today, or the coverage would be revoked immediately. Bryce added a cruel note stating that medical bills could be quite a heavy burden for someone without a checking account, and warned me not to make this harder on my family than it needed to be. Bryce was not just an arrogant financial broker, he was a sociopath. He actually thought he could use my disabled mother as leverage to force me into submission. He thought a covert photograph and a cowardly financial threat would terrify me into compliance. He expected me to panic, to call him begging for mercy, to concede everything to protect the woman who had raised me. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The cold, calculating fury that washed over me was absolute and all-consuming. I looked up at the wall of monitors, then back down at Agent Vance. Vance, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that made the seasoned investigators stand up straight. I want a 24-hour federal protection detail stationed at Savannah Memorial Hospital immediately. No one goes near my mother or her room without classified clearance. If anyone from Bryce or his camp even drives past that facility, I want them detained. Yes, Colonel, right away, Vance responded, turning quickly to his communication console. And Vance, I added, locking my phone screen and setting it face down on the glass table. Pull up the Department of Defense shipping manifest for Bryce. The medical supplies he imported from overseas last month. The ones he plans to use to fulfill Marcus and his massive government contract. Vance hesitated quickly, bringing up the encrypted documents on the main screen. We have them, Colonel. They are listed as sterile surgical kits and advanced combat trauma supplies. They are counterfeit, I stated, the pieces of the puzzle perfectly snapping into place. He bought substandard, non-sterile equipment from a blacklisted manufacturer and forged the safety certifications to cut costs. He is planning to sell infected medical supplies to the United States military. The room went dead silent. The analyst stopped typing. Selling counterfeit tactical gear was a federal crime. Selling contaminated medical supplies to combat medics serving overseas was an act of profound betrayal and treason. I want the warehouse location I ordered standing up from the table. I want the import records, the forged signatures, and the exact paper trail linking Bryce and his shell company directly to Marcus and his CEO authorization. They thought they could threaten my family to protect their wealth. I am going to obliterate theirs. The morning sun was just beginning to hit the sleek glass exterior of the Alpha Defense Solutions headquarters when my government-issued SUV pulled up to the curb. The building was a monument to Marcus's ego. It was an imposing structure of steel and reflective glass, located in the heart of Atlanta's premier business district, funded entirely by the deceit he and Bryce had orchestrated behind closed doors. I stepped out of the vehicle, the cool morning air biting at my bare arms. I had not bothered to change out of my ruined silk dress. The dark wine stain splashed across my chest was no longer a mark of humiliation. It was a badge of war. I pushed through the revolving glass doors and strode purposefully across the expansive marble lobby. The morning rush was in full swing, with young executives and administrative staff hurrying to the elevators with their overpriced coffees. The moment I approached the security turnstiles, a bulky guard in a fitted suit stepped directly into my path. I recognized him immediately. His name was Peterson, the head of corporate security. He raised a large hand, his expression shifting into a forced patronizing smile. "I am sorry, Mrs. Washington," Peterson said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding employees. "Mr. Washington left strict and explicit orders at the desk this morning. Your access badge has been deactivated and you are no longer permitted anywhere on the premises. I'm going to have to ask you to turn around and leave the building before I call the local authorities." I did not stop walking. I did not raise my voice or break my stride. I simply closed the distance between us, stepping so far into his personal space that he involuntarily shifted his weight backward. "Peterson," I said, my voice dropping to a low, authoritative register that cut effortlessly through the ambient noise of the lobby. "You are currently obstructing a federal agent operating under Directive Alpha 7 Tango. Interfering with a Level 4 federal investigation carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. If you do not step aside immediately, I will have the tactical unit waiting outside, place you in zip ties, and you will lose your security license before lunchtime." Peterson froze. The patronizing smile vanished, completely wiped away by the absolute lethal certainty in my eyes. He was trained to handle angry spouses and disgruntled employees. He was not trained to handle a former judge, advocate, general corps prosecutor, leveraging the full weight of the United States government. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the black SUV idling menacingly at the curb outside. He slowly lowered his hand and stepped aside. I walked past him, swiped my newly activated federal credential against the turnstile scanner, and stepped onto the executive elevator. The ride to the top floor took exactly 42 seconds. My mind was perfectly clear, calculating the variables of the room I was about to enter. Marcus always held his quarterly stakeholder meetings on the final Friday of the month. He would be in the main boardroom right now, surrounded by his major investors, his chief financial officers, and Bryce standing proudly by his side. They would be celebrating the multi-million-dollar Department of Defense contract, counting the phantom money they thought they had just secured. The elevator doors chimed and parted. I walked down the plush carpeted hallway, bypassing the frantic receptionist who stood up and tried to call out to me. I reached the heavy double oak doors of the executive boardroom and pushed them open with enough force to make them hit the interior walls with a loud, resonant crack. The entire room jumped. 12 men and women in immaculate business attire turned to stare at me in absolute shock. Marcus was standing at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, a laser pointer in his hand, and a smug, triumphant smile frozen on his handsome face. A massive digital presentation displaying projected military revenue illuminated the screen behind him. Bryce was lounging in a leather chair to his right, looking like a cat who had just swallowed a canary. When Marcus processed the sight of me standing in the doorway wearing the same dress from the country club stained with dried red wine, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, slamming his laser pointer onto the table. He immediately turned to the board members, projecting his practiced tone of a reasonable man dealing with an unreasonable burden. Gentlemen, ladies, please excuse this unfortunate interruption. As some of you know, my wife and I are currently going through a divorce. She is clearly experiencing a severe mental health crisis. He marched toward me, grabbing my upper arm with a bruising grip, intending to physically drag me out of the room. Security is on the way, Zora. You are going to leave this building right now, or I will have you thrown into a psychiatric hold. I did not struggle. I simply shifted my weight, trapped his wrist against my body, and applied a precise military joint lock. Marcus gasped in sudden sharp pain, releasing my arm instantly and stumbling backward. The board members let out a collective gasp of alarm. "Do not ever put your hands on me again, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing like ice in the cavernous room, "and security is not coming." I relieved Peterson of his duties in the lobby. "I suggest you sit down and listen very carefully because your entire corporate empire is about to burn to the ground." I stepped to the center of the mahogany table. I reached into my clutch purse and pulled out a heavy encrypted silver USB drive. I dropped it onto the polished wood. The metal clattered loudly, sliding a few inches before coming to a complete stop directly in front of the lead investor. "This is not a domestic dispute," I announced, addressing the shocked board members directly. "This is a federal warning. Before any of you sign off on the third quarter revenue projections currently displayed on that screen, you need to know that your CEO has just entangled this company in a massive international fraud ring." I pointed a finger at Bryce, whose smug expression was beginning to twitch. "The multi-million-dollar Department of Defense contract you are celebrating today is built on counterfeit goods." I said my words, striking the room like physical blows. "Your supply chain director, Bryce Washington, has been importing non-sterile surgical equipment from a blacklisted manufacturer in Shenzhen. He has been forging Food and Drug Administration safety certifications and passing off contaminated gear as advanced combat trauma supplies." The room erupted into panicked murmurs. The lead investor, a stern woman with iron gray hair, picked up the USB drive and stared at Marcus. Marcus was completely pale, his jaw working silently as he tried to formulate a defense. He looked at Bryce, panic flooding his eyes. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "You are preparing to sell fake chitosan-based hemostatic dressings to combat medics," I continued, my voice rising with righteous fury. "The bandages designed to stop arterial bleeding in active war zones are completely non-functional. You are padding your corporate margins with the blood of American soldiers. The federal audit was triggered at 0400 hours this morning. Every account, every warehouse, and every shipping manifest is currently being seized by federal agents." I waited for the collapse. I waited for Bryce to panic the way he had at the country club when I exposed his Cayman Islands tax evasion. I expected him to scramble to deny the allegations or point the finger at Marcus to save his own skin. Instead, Bryce let out a low, sharp chuckle. The chuckle grew into a full, arrogant laugh. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, interlacing his fingers and resting them on his stomach. He looked around the panicked boardroom with absolute supreme confidence. The fear I had seen in his eyes last night was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying arrogance of a man who believed the rules simply did not apply to him. "You really think you stumbled onto something brilliant here, Zora?" Bryce asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He stood up casually, buttoning his suit jacket. "You think you are a hero? You think coming in here with a silver flash drive and a stained dress makes you an authority figure? You are so entirely out of your depth, it is actually pathetic." He walked around the table, stopping just a few feet away from me. "Do you honestly believe I would run a supply chain of this magnitude without securing the proper insurance?" Bryce sneered, looking down at me. "We are not dealing with local beat cops, Zora. We have friends at the Pentagon. Real friends. We have a highly decorated procurement officer, a one-star general who personally signs off on every single shipment that leaves our facility. He knows exactly where the supplies come from. He gets his percentage and we get our contract. The system works perfectly until a bitter unemployed woman decides to throw a public tantrum because her husband finally got tired of her dragging him down. Bryce leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. His pale eyes were completely devoid of fear. There will be no federal audit, Zora. My guy at the Department of Defense will squash your little complaint before it even reaches a desk. You are a jobless, desperate legal secretary who got locked out of her own house. I am a corporate executive backed by the United States military. Go ahead. Pick up your little silver drive and march down to the local precinct. Call the police if you dare. See who they believe. You will be sitting in a holding cell for corporate espionage and trespassing before the sun goes down. I looked at Bryce, a man so intoxicated by his own perceived invincibility that he could not see the crosshairs painted directly on his chest. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, desperate energy. I simply let my gaze sweep across the terrified faces of the board members lingering on the lead investor, who was still clutching the silver flash drive like it was a live grenade. The data on that drive is fully decrypted, I said, addressing the investors rather than Bryce. You have exactly 24 hours to review the supply chain logs and report your findings to the Department of Justice. If you choose to ignore it, you will be indicted as co-conspirators in a federal treason case. The choice is entirely yours. I turned my back on Bryce's sputtering rage and Marcus's stunned silence. I walked out of the boardroom with the same measured clinical precision I had used to enter. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sudden eruption of panicked shouting from the executives. I did not wait for the elevator. I took the stairwell, moving swiftly and silently down to the ground floor, where Agent Miller and the armored SUV were waiting to extract me. The initial strike was delivered. Now it was time to let the enemy make their fatal mistake. Hours later, the atmosphere inside Situation Room 4 was a portrait of absolute focused stillness. The frantic energy of Marcus's corporate headquarters was a world away. Here in the subterranean federal bunker, there was only the low hum of server cooling fans and the soft, rhythmic tapping of keyboards. I sat alone at the far end of the long glass table. Directly in front of me, resting under the harsh glare of a single overhead spotlight, lay a thick manila envelope. It had been delivered to the facility's secure mailroom just moments ago, hand-delivered by a private courier. The return address bore the gold-embossed seal of Sterling and Vance, one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigation firms on the East Coast. Beatrice Washington had wasted absolutely no time. I reached out and broke the wax seal, sliding the heavy parchment documents onto the glass table. It was an emergency federal court summons. Beatrice had used her immense wealth and social influence to bypass standard legal procedures, fast-tracking an emergency injunction directly to a federal judge. She was not just trying to finalize a divorce or protect Marcus's assets. She was executing a targeted scorched earth campaign designed to leave me entirely destitute. I read through the dense legal jargon, my face remaining a mask of calm detachment. Beatrice and her high-priced legal team had filed a motion for asset seizure, claiming that my disruptive public behavior at the country club had caused irreparable economic damage to Marcus's company. But they were not coming after my non-existent joint bank accounts. They were coming after the only tangible asset I had ever truly cared about. Attached to the summons was a detailed property deed for 400 acres of prime, untouched coastal real estate in South Carolina. The land had been in my family for 4 generations, purchased by my great-grandfather immediately following the Reconstruction era. It was a sprawling expanse of ancient oak trees and deep water access that had recently been appraised at over $12 million due to a newly approved commercial zoning initiative. It was my ancestral home, the absolute bedrock of my family's heritage. Beatrice had somehow uncovered the true value of the land, and her greed had completely overridden her common sense. The legal filing claimed that because I was married to Marcus when the land's value skyrocketed, he was entitled to a controlling interest in the property. She wanted to strip me of my heritage and sell the land to developers to cover the imaginary losses I had supposedly inflicted on her precious son. My civilian cell phone sitting next to the summons vibrated harshly against the glass table. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Beatrice. I picked it up and read the words she had typed in a fit of arrogant malice. "Get ready to wear prison clothes, you brat. My family has the best legal team on the East Coast. We are taking the land. We are taking everything. You should have walked away when you had the chance. I set the phone down and let out a slow, quiet breath. Beatrice thought she had just delivered the killing blow. She thought she had outsmarted me using her vast resources to buy a legal victory that would crush my spirit and leave me begging for mercy. She genuinely believed that hiring an elite law firm to file an aggressive federal lawsuit would terrify a simple legal secretary into submission. She had no idea that she had just walked blindly into a meticulously designed tactical trap. I looked at the summons again, a genuine cold smile finally breaking across my face. In order to file this emergency injunction in a federal court, Beatrice's lawyers had been required to submit sworn financial affidavits detailing Marcus's corporate revenue and Bryce's supply chain ledgers. They had to legally prove the economic damages they were claiming. By submitting those documents to a federal judge, Beatrice and her attorneys had officially entered fraudulent financial records into the United States judicial system. They had just committed perjury, wire fraud, and federal obstruction of justice on the public record. For 5 years, I had been forced to watch Beatrice Washington use her money to manipulate the law, buying off politicians and crushing anyone who stood in her family's way. I knew that the moment I threatened their empire, her ego would not allow her to simply defend herself. She would go on the offensive. She would try to take something that mattered to me. I had deliberately left the coastal property deed in my home office desk, knowing she would search my belongings the moment Marcus locked me out. I had dangled a $12 million piece of bait right in front of her greedy eyes, and she had swallowed it whole. Because Beatrice had officially linked her personal wealth and Marcus's corporate assets to a fraudulent federal lawsuit, I now had the legal authority to bypass civil court entirely. I did not need a divorce lawyer. I had the full, unmitigated power of the Patriot Act and federal RICO statutes at my disposal. Beatrice had just handed me the key to freeze every single offshore account, trust fund, and real estate holding the Washington family possessed. I reached across the table and picked up the secure encrypted red phone. I bypassed the standard communication relays and dialed a direct classified line to a specific office inside the Pentagon. The line clicked and connected instantly. Colonel Washington, a deep, gravelly voice, answered on the other end. "General," I said, my eyes locked on the summons resting under the harsh spotlight. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripped of all emotion, and focused entirely on the execution of the mission. They took the bait. Let us pull the net. I stood there as the federal analysts scrambled to execute my orders, pulling the warehouse coordinates and the forged shipping manifests with brutal efficiency. The sterile, brightly lit air of the underground bunker hummed with the high-stakes adrenaline of the hunt. I watched the data streams cascade across the massive monitors, but my mind was already moving 3 steps ahead of the current tactical objective. I turned away from the glass table and walked deliberately toward the reinforced titanium vault at the far end of the command center. Agent Vance anticipated my movement, stepping forward quickly to engage the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door glided open with a sharp pneumatic hiss, revealing a stark secondary chamber. In the absolute center of the room, resting on a simple metal table, sat a heavy antique wooden trunk bound in weathered leather and tarnished brass. I stepped up to the trunk, feeling a profound sense of gravity settle over my shoulders. I unfastened the heavy brass latches. They snapped open with a loud metallic crack that echoed against the concrete walls. As I pushed the heavy wooden lid back, the distinct scent of cedar and brass polish filled the air. I reached inside, pulling aside the protective dark canvas. Beneath it lay the pristine, perfectly pressed dark navy fabric of my military dress uniform. As I lifted the heavy jacket, the overhead fluorescent lights caught the brilliant silver eagles pinned to the epaulets, the undeniable insignia of a full colonel in the United States Army. I ran my thumb over the rows of colorful commendations and heavy medals meticulously arranged on the left breast. The Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Joint Service Commendation Medal. These were not ceremonial trinkets handed out for desk work. They were earned in the grueling trenches of international military tribunals, dismantling global crime syndicates and prosecuting high treason. For 5 long, agonizing years, I had buried this woman. I had locked the colonel away inside this wooden trunk and assumed the identity of Zora Washington, the quiet, unassuming paralegal. I had intentionally made myself small to fit into their narrow, arrogant worldview. I had worn cheap, sensible suits and kept my head bowed. I had allowed Marcus to lecture me on corporate ambition and business strategy. I had sat silently at country club dinners while Beatrice and Chloe mocked my public school background and my lack of high society refinement. I had filed their mundane legal paperwork and smiled placidly while they treated me like the hired help. They genuinely believed I was a desperate charity case who had gotten incredibly lucky by marrying into Atlanta royalty. They never once suspected that our entire marriage was a targeted hostile infiltration. The Department of Defense had identified Marcus's company as a potential security risk half a decade ago, but they needed a ghost inside the machine to map the network and trace the illicit supply chains. I was that ghost. I was the United States Judge Advocate General Corps' most lethal asset specifically deployed to dismantle corrupt military contractors from the inside out. My marriage to Marcus was not a tragic love story or a failed romance. It was a highly classified long-term undercover deployment. I had spent 5 years playing the submissive, poorly dressed wife, specifically to gather the evidence required to put this entire syndicate behind federal bars. I carried the heavy uniform jacket out of the vault and draped it carefully over the back of my chair at the head of the conference table. The visual impact on the room was immediate. The analysts sat a little straighter, their focus sharpening. The disguise was completely shed. I turned my attention back to the digital war room. The forensic accountants had finished rendering the entire operational and financial hierarchy of Alpha Defense Solutions and Apex Holdings. A massive complex web of red and green lines connected shell companies, offshore trusts, and domestic corporate accounts across the primary viewing screen. Agent Vance stepped up to the main console, his face grim. Colonel The Cross referenced data from the Shenzhen Port Authority, just finished compiling. We have mapped the entire supply chain for the counterfeit Chitosan bandages. I looked at the glowing digital signatures and authorization protocols blinking on the screen. Marcus was the chief executive officer on paper. He was the handsome, arrogant face of the company posing for local business magazines and shaking hands with ambitious politicians. But Marcus was fundamentally lazy and completely blinded by his own desperate need for validation. He never read the dense supply chain manifests he signed. He just wanted the wealth and the prestige. Look at the routing origin points, I said, tapping the glass table. Every single logistical command, every wire transfer to the blacklisted Chinese manufacturers, every forged Food and Drug Administration safety certification originated from a specific secure IP address. Vance zoomed in on the data node. It was registered directly to Bryce. The pale, smug brother-in-law who had stood in the boardroom and mocked my career was not just a side character trying to make a quick commission. Bryce was the actual architect. He was the absolute mastermind of the entire operation. He had recognized Marcus's desperate, blinding ambition and weaponized it. Bryce had used his marriage to Chloe to embed himself in the Washington family, specifically to use Marcus's minority-owned business status to secure lucrative federal contracts. Bryce pulled every single string from the shadows, hiding behind Marcus's arrogant facade while importing contaminated medical supplies intended for American combat medics. Before I could order the tactical strike teams to secure Bryce's warehouse, the heavy reinforced door of the command center chimed. An armed guard stepped inside, carrying a thick manila envelope bearing the gold-embossed seal of Sterling and Vance, one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate litigation firms on the East Coast. The guard handed the envelope directly to me. I broke the wax seal and slid the heavy parchment documents onto the glass table. It was an emergency federal court summons. Beatrice Washington had wasted absolutely no time. She had used her immense wealth and social influence to bypass standard legal procedures, fast-tracking an emergency injunction directly to a federal judge. She was not just trying to finalize a rapid divorce or protect Marcus's corporate assets. She was executing a targeted scorched earth campaign designed to leave me entirely destitute. I read through the dense, aggressive legal jargon, my face remaining a mask of calm detachment. Beatrice and her high-priced legal team had filed a motion for immediate asset seizure, claiming that my disruptive public behavior at the country club had caused irreparable economic damage to Marcus's company. But they were not coming after my non-existent joint bank accounts. They were coming after the only tangible asset I had ever truly cared about. Attached to the summons was a detailed property deed for 400 acres of prime untouched coastal real estate in South Carolina. The land had been in my family for 4 generations, purchased by my great-grandfather immediately following the Reconstruction era. It was a sprawling expanse of ancient oak trees and deep water access that had recently been appraised at over $12 million due to a newly approved commercial zoning initiative. It was my ancestral home, the absolute bedrock of my family's heritage. Beatrice had somehow uncovered the true value of the land, and her staggering greed had completely overridden her common sense. The legal filing claimed that because I was married to Marcus, when the land's value skyrocketed, he was entitled to a controlling financial interest in the property. She wanted to strip me of my heritage and sell the land to commercial developers to cover the imaginary losses I had supposedly inflicted on her precious son. My civilian cell phone sitting next to the federal summons vibrated harshly against the glass table. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Beatrice. I picked it up and read the words she had typed in a fit of arrogant malice. "Prepare to wear prison clothes, you classless wretch. My family has the best legal team on the East Coast. We are taking the land. We are taking everything. You should have walked away and stayed in the gutter where you belong." I set the phone down and let out a slow, quiet breath. Beatrice thought she had just delivered the killing blow. She thought she had outsmarted me, using her vast resources to buy a legal victory that would crush my spirit and leave me begging for mercy. She genuinely believed that hiring an elite law firm to file an aggressive federal lawsuit would terrify a simple legal secretary into submission. She had no idea that she had just walked blindly into a meticulously designed tactical trap. In order to file this emergency injunction in a federal court, Beatrice's lawyers had been required to submit sworn financial affidavits detailing Marcus's corporate revenue and Bryce's supply chain ledgers. They had to legally prove the economic damages they were claiming, and they had to prove they had the clean capital to retain a firm like Sterling and Vance. By submitting those documents to a federal judge, Beatrice and her attorneys had officially entered fraudulent financial records into the United States judicial system. I looked at the complex web of financial transfers on the main monitor. Bryce was moving the counterfeit profits from the Cayman Islands Trust back into the United States to fund the Washington family's lavish lifestyle and pay these elite lawyers. But moving millions of dollars of dirty money across federal borders requires a domestic washing machine. You cannot just wire offshore cash into a personal checking account. I traced the secondary overlay, highlighting a single nonprofit organization receiving systematic anonymous donations from the offshore trust. The money was being brought into the country disguised as charitable contributions. I zoomed in on the tax identification number. It matched the First Baptist Church of Atlanta. Specifically, it matched the Community Outreach and Building Fund. I looked at the name listed as the primary signatory and sole overseer of that specific church fund, Beatrice Washington. The deeply religious country club matriarch, who had just threatened me with prison, was using the house of God to launder blood money. She was washing the profits of infected combat bandages through the church collection plates. She knew exactly where the money was coming from, and she was coordinating the entire financial cleanup. I looked at the federal summons one last time, a genuine cold smile breaking across my face. I picked up the secure encrypted red phone. I bypassed the standard communication relays and dialed a direct classified line to the Pentagon. The line clicked and connected instantly. General, I said, my voice projecting the absolute lethal certainty of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. They have taken the bait completely. Pull the net. The heavy receiver clicked securely into its cradle, echoing with finality across the subterranean command center. I turned away from the glass table and walked directly to the tactical elevator. The operation was moving into its most volatile phase. The camera of the facility security system tracked my movements with a smooth mechanical hum as I descended 3 levels below the bustling Atlanta streets, stepping out into the damp, echoing expanse of a secured underground parking garage. The air was thick with the scent of motor oil and cold concrete. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked gray pillars. I walked with measured, deliberate steps, my dark trench coat pulled tight against the subterranean chill. In the darkest corner of the lowest level, a sleek black Mercedes SUV idled silently. As I approached, the headlights flashed twice in quick succession. The heavy driver's side door opened, and Chloe stepped out into the dim light. The immaculate, perfectly manicured country club princess was completely gone. In her place stood a terrified, exhausted woman, trembling inside an oversized designer coat. She looked over her shoulders, scanning the empty concrete pillars like a hunted animal. Her flawless makeup was smudged, her hands shaking violently as she clutched a thick leather portfolio to her chest. This was the woman who had spent the last 5 years sneering at my modest wardrobe and laughing openly at Beatrice's cruel jokes regarding my background. Now she looked like she was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. "Zora," she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Thank God you actually came. I did not know who else to call." "Colonel Washington!" I corrected my voice, cutting through the damp air like a serrated blade. "We are not friends, Chloe. We are not having a social visit. You triggered a federal emergency distress signal using the burner phone I slipped into your purse last night. You have exactly 3 minutes to tell me why I should not have a tactical team place you in handcuffs right now as an accessory to international fraud." Chloe flinched, physically recoiling from the absolute lack of sympathy in my voice. She hugged the leather portfolio tighter against her chest, tears brimming in her pale eyes. "Bryce is going to kill me!" She choked out, her voice cracking with raw, visceral panic. "He is a monster, Zora. You have no idea what he is like behind closed doors. When you exposed him at the country club last night, he came home and tore his office apart. He was screaming about federal audits and frozen accounts. I went into his private safe after he passed out. I found the incorporation papers." She took a ragged breath, stepping closer. "He put everything in my name, Zora. All of it. Apex Holdings, the Cayman Islands, trusts the import licenses for the military medical supplies. He used my social security number and my family's clean aristocratic background to legitimize the entire operation. I am the sole legal guarantor on over $40 million in fraudulent government contracts. If the Department of Defense brings the hammer down, Bryce walks away clean. I am the one who goes to federal prison for treason. He set me up to be the ultimate sacrificial lamb." She held the leather portfolio out toward me, her hands trembling so badly the metal clasps rattled. "I brought the evidence," Chloe pleaded, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "I brought Beatrice's personal physical ledgers, the ones she keeps locked in the church vault. It details every single dollar she laundered through the congregation to wash Bryce's counterfeit money. I have all the offshore routing keys, the forged signatures, and the emails proving Marcus authorized the shipments. I will give you everything. I will give you the entire Washington family on a silver platter. I just need you to promise me immunity. Please, Zora. Use your federal clearance. Give me a deal and guarantee I do not go to prison." I did not reach for the portfolio. I simply stood there, my posture rigid and unyielding, studying the desperate woman crumbling before me. I remembered standing in Beatrice's foyer, holding a tray of cheap appetizers, while Chloe mocked the fabric of my dress. I remembered the way she eagerly participated in my humiliation, desperate to secure her own position within the Washington family hierarchy. She had gladly reaped the financial benefits of Bryce's crimes, wrapping herself in diamonds, paid for by contaminated military supplies. Now that the ship was sinking, she wanted a life raft, Do I look like a public defender, Chloe? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. Do I look like someone who negotiates back alley deals out of pity? You drank the champagne. You wore the designer gowns. You stood right next to Beatrice and laughed while they systematically tried to strip me of my dignity. You enjoyed the privilege of that blood money, and now you want to hand over a notebook and walk away entirely unscathed. Zora, please, she sobbed, falling to her knees on the cold concrete. I had no choice. He abused me. He controlled my finances. I was terrified of him. Get up! I commanded the sharp authority of my military rank, forcing her back to her feet. The Department of Justice does not hand out immunity deals in dark parking garages. I do not care about your tears, and I do not care about your apologies. If you want to survive the absolute hellfire that is about to rain down on the Washington family, you are going to take the hard road. You are not going to hide behind a secret deal. You are going to take the witness stand in a federal courtroom. You are going to look the presiding judge in the eye, point your finger directly at your husband and your mother-in-law, and confess to your role in the conspiracy. You will testify on the public record. You will face the fire. That is the only way you earn your freedom. Chloe stared at me in absolute horror. Bryce will destroy me, she whispered. Beatrice will ruin my family's name. They will drag my reputation through the mud. They will say I am insane. Beatrice is currently facing federal RICO charges, and Bryce is looking at 20 years in Leavenworth for defrauding the Department of Defense, I stated coldly. They are not going to have a reputation left to protect. You can either stand with the federal government and testify as a cooperating witness, or you can stand with your husband and go down as the primary architect of a treasonous conspiracy. Pick your executioner, Chloe, right now. She squeezed her eyes shut, a violent sob tearing from her throat. She realized she was completely outmatched. The terrifying reality of her situation had finally broken through her aristocratic entitlement. Slowly, her hands shaking, she held the leather portfolio out again. I will testify, she whispered, her voice broken and hollow. I will do whatever you tell me to do, just keep me away from him. I stepped forward and snatched the heavy portfolio from her grasp. I pulled a secure encrypted comms device from my pocket and handed it to her. Drive to the address programmed into that phone. Do not stop for gas. Do not call your family. Do not go home to pack a bag. Federal marshals are waiting at that location to place you under protective custody. If you deviate from the route by a single block, the deal is entirely off, and I will issue a warrant for your immediate arrest. Do you understand? Yes, she nodded frantically, scrambling back into the driver's seat of the Mercedes. Thank you, Zora. Thank you. The heavy SUV roared to life, its tires echoing against the concrete, as Chloe sped toward the exit ramp, desperate to escape the nightmare she had married into. I stood alone in the dim garage, feeling the immense weight of the physical ledgers in my hand. Beatrice's entire money laundering operation was locked inside this leather binder. The final piece of the puzzle had just fallen perfectly into place. I turned on my heel, preparing to head back to the secure elevator. Suddenly, the piercing, high-pitched screech of heavy tires echoed through the subterranean level. Two unmarked matte black vans tore around the concrete pillars, moving with terrifying military precision. They slammed on their brakes, positioned perfectly to block both the exit ramp and my path back to the elevator. The harsh glare of their high beams pinned me against the concrete wall, blinding me momentarily. My personal cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I did not need to look at the screen to know who was calling. Beatrice Washington had not just hired expensive lawyers. She was a cornered, deeply paranoid animal. She had tracked her own daughter-in-law's vehicle using an unauthorized GPS transponder. She knew Chloe was breaking ranks, and she knew exactly what was inside the portfolio I was holding. The side doors of the van slid open simultaneously. 6 heavily built men wearing unmarked tactical gear and dark masks stepped out onto the concrete. They moved silently, spreading out to flank me and cut off any potential avenue of escape. They were not local street thugs. They were private mercenaries moving with the disciplined aggression of hired hitmen. The phone in my pocket buzzed again, receiving a text message. I pulled it out, keeping my eyes locked on the advancing mercenaries. The message was from Beatrice. Did you really think I would not track my own daughter-in-law's car, give my men the ledger and the federal summons, or you do not leave that garage alive? I looked at the text message and then up at the 6 armed men advancing toward me in the dim light. I carefully placed my cell phone back into my pocket. I did not panic. I did not shout for help. I simply smiled a cold, predatory smirk that made the lead mercenary hesitate for a fraction of a second. They thought they had cornered a helpless legal secretary. They had no idea they had just engaged a combat veteran in an enclosed space. I slowly slid the heavy leather portfolio into my trench coat, reaching down to disengage the safety on the concealed tactical holster resting at my hip. "You gentlemen are standing in the wrong parking garage," I said, my voice echoing cleanly against the concrete. I drew my weapon. The sharp, deafening crack of my standard-issue Sig Sauer echoed through the subterranean concrete cavern. I did not aim for center mass. I aimed with precise, calculated intent at the concrete floor directly beneath the lead mercenary's boots. The high-velocity round shattered the pavement, sending razor-sharp fragments of stone flying upward. He instinctively threw his hands up to protect his face, his forward momentum breaking instantly. The 5 men behind him froze for a crucial microsecond, shocked by the sudden, aggressive resistance from a woman they assumed would simply surrender. That single microsecond was all the time a trained operative needed. I did not hesitate. I shifted my aim and fired 2 rapid consecutive shots, blowing out the front tires of the primary black van blocking my exit. The explosive sound of rupturing rubber compounded the chaos, echoing violently in the enclosed space. As the heavy vehicle dropped onto its rims, completely immobilizing it, I sprinted laterally toward the reinforced concrete pillar to my left. Suppressed return fire hissed through the air behind me, chipping away the masonry where I had been standing just a moment before. They were professionals, but they were entirely unprepared for a target who actively engaged them with military tactics. I holstered my weapon and broke cover, sprinting toward the heavy government-issued SUV parked 3 spaces away in the shadows. I hit the remote unlock, sliding into the driver's seat and slamming the door shut in one fluid, continuous motion. The reinforced engine roared to life with a deep, guttural growl. Through the windshield, I saw the mercenaries recovering their formation, leveling their weapons at my vehicle. They expected me to panic and reverse. Instead, I slammed the transmission into drive and crushed the accelerator to the floor. The massive armored SUV surged forward like a battering ram. I aimed directly for the narrow gap between the disabled van and the concrete wall. The mercenaries scrambled out of the way, diving onto the damp floor to avoid being crushed. Metal screamed against metal as the side of my vehicle scraped the van, shearing off the side mirror and sending sparks flying into the darkness. I broke through the blockade, hit the exit ramp, and rocketed up into the cool Atlanta night. My encrypted earpiece chimed immediately. It was Agent Vance monitoring the situation from the command center. "Colonel, we have eyes on your position," Vance stated, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Traffic cameras confirm 2 additional hostile vehicles converging on your route from the adjacent surface streets. Beatrice had backup teams waiting in the perimeter. We have also confirmed that the primary witness has safely breached the federal marshal checkpoint. Chloe is secure." "Good," I replied, gripping the leather steering wheel, my eyes scanning the rear-view mirror. "Keep the marshals locked down tight around her. No one gets in or out of that safe house without my direct authorization. Now track these pursuing vehicles and guide me into the industrial sector. I need to shear them off before I reach the courthouse." "Understood," Colonel Vance replied. "Take the next right onto Marietta Street. You have a clear path for exactly 4 blocks before they close the distance." I jerked the steering wheel, throwing the heavy SUV into a sharp right turn. The tires shrieked in protest against the asphalt. Glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw the blinding high beams of 2 dark sedans aggressively cutting through the late-night traffic to stay on my tail. Beatrice was truly desperate. She had realized that the leather portfolio resting on my passenger seat was the definitive nail in her coffin. That single binder contained the physical handwritten ledgers proving she had used her pristine church to launder the blood money generated by Bryce and his counterfeit military supplies. If that ledger made it to a federal judge, the entire Washington family would be facing decades in federal prison. She was willing to risk an open street war to get it back. I accelerated, pushing the heavy engine to its absolute limit. The neon lights of downtown Atlanta blurred past my windows. I kept my breathing slow and measured, relying on years of evasive driving training. The pursuing sedans were fast, but they were driven by hired muscle who relied on aggression rather than precision. I needed to use their momentum against them. Take the next exit toward the old rail yard, Vance instructed over the comms. The streets are narrow and abandoned. I killed the headlights, plunging my SUV into darkness as I took the exit ramp at dangerous speed. Navigating by the ambient glow of the city skyline, I tore down the deserted industrial road. The two sedans followed blindly, their high beams slicing through the dark. I approached a sharp left turn, bordered by a high brick wall and a row of steel shipping containers. I did not tap the brakes. Instead, I pulled the emergency handbrake and aggressively spun the steering wheel, throwing the heavy vehicle into a controlled tactical slide. The SUV pivoted flawlessly, tires smoking as I slid the vehicle into the narrow gap between two massive steel containers entirely out of sight. I dropped the gear into park and held my breath. Less than 3 seconds later, the first pursuing sedan roared past the intersection, completely missing my turnoff. The driver realized his mistake too late, slamming on the brakes. The second sedan, following too closely behind, could not stop in time. The sickening crunch of metal and shattering glass echoed through the empty rail yard as the two hostile vehicles collided violently, rendering them both inoperable. Target neutralized, Vance confirmed a moment later. The local police are responding to the crash site. You have a clear path to the federal district. I exhaled slowly, turning my headlights back on and reversing out of the hiding spot. The drive to the Richard B. Russell Federal Building took less than 10 minutes. The towering monolith of white stone and glass loomed against the night sky, a silent fortress of justice. I bypassed the civilian parking and pulled directly up to the subterranean security gate. Two armed federal guards stepped out of the booth, their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons as they approached my vehicle. I rolled down the window and held out my Level 4 clearance badge. The moment the scanner registered the Silver Eagle and the biometric code, the guard's demeanor instantly shifted. He stood at attention, snapping a crisp salute before authorizing the heavy steel barricades to retract. I parked the SUV, grabbed the heavy leather portfolio, and walked toward the private judicial elevators. The halls of the federal courthouse were completely silent at this hour, bathed in the dim security lighting. My footsteps echoed against the polished marble floors. I was still wearing the ruined silk dress, the dark wine stain splashed across my chest, a stark contrast to the sterile professional environment. It was a physical reminder of the arrogance and cruelty I was about to dismantle. I reached the heavy double doors of the Chief Magistrate's chambers. Judge Robert Sterling was a notoriously ruthless federal judge who had previously worked with the Judge Advocate General Corps on high-level military corruption cases. He was not a man who could be bought, manipulated, or intimidated by local Atlanta elites. I pushed the doors open. Judge Sterling was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, illuminated by a single brass reading lamp. He looked up, adjusting his glasses as I walked into the room. "Colonel Washington," he said, his voice echoing with quiet authority. "I was told you were initiating an emergency classified protocol tonight. I did not expect you to look like you just walked out of a war zone. Sometimes the battlefield is a country club dining room." "Judge," I replied, walking forward and placing the heavy leather portfolio directly in the center of his desk. "And sometimes the casualties are self-inflicted." I opened the portfolio, revealing the meticulous handwritten ledgers, the forged shipping manifests, and the offshore routing numbers Chloe had surrendered. "This is the physical evidence required to execute Directive Alpha 7 Tango 1 stated formally. The Washington family has filed a fraudulent emergency injunction in civil court attempting to seize my ancestral property. They have entered manipulated financial documents into the public record. This ledger proves that Beatrice Washington is currently laundering millions of dollars of illicit military funds through the First Baptist Church. Bryce Washington is importing counterfeit trauma gear for the Department of Defense. Marcus Washington is the authorizing signature for the entire operation. Judge Sterling slowly opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the columns of damning numbers. His expression hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury. "The sheer audacity of this fraud is staggering," he murmured. "They genuinely believed their wealth made them untouchable." "They did," I agreed. "And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, they are going to walk into a civil courtroom, believing they are about to strip me of everything I own. They are going to bring their expensive lawyers and their arrogant smiles. They think they have isolated a helpless woman." Judge Sterling looked up, closing the ledger and placing his hand flat on top of the leather cover. "Are you requesting a federal strike team to intercept them at the civil hearing, Colonel?" "No," I said, a cold, hard smile touching the corners of my mouth. "I want them to step into the courtroom. I want Beatrice to sit in the gallery. I want Marcus to stand before the civil judge and officially present his fraudulent claims on the record. Let them commit their perjury in broad daylight. Let them feel the absolute certainty of their victory." I turned away from the desk, looking out the large window at the quiet city below. Tomorrow morning, I am going to walk into that civil courtroom completely alone. I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I am going to let them think they have won. And right when they demand the judge sign the order seizing my property, I want federal marshals to lock every single door in that building. Let them build their own scaffold, Judge. I will personally pull the lever. The morning sun cut harsh geometric angles across the polished mahogany benches of Courtroom 4B in the Richard B. Russell Federal Building. The air inside was sterile, smelling of lemon polish and expensive cologne. If there had been a camera capturing the moment I walked through the heavy swinging doors, it would have been positioned directly over Beatrice Washington's shoulder, perfectly framing my entrance from her perspective. From that vantage point, I looked exactly like the pathetic, helpless victim they had spent 5 years conditioning me to be. I stepped into the center aisle completely alone. I wore the same sensible beige off-the-rack suit I had worn to my first paralegal interview. My hair was pulled back tightly into a severe, unassuming bun. I carried no designer bags, no boxes of evidence, and I had no team of aggressive paralegals trailing behind me. I clutched a single scuffed leather briefcase to my chest, looking small against the imposing architecture of the federal courthouse. The plaintiff's table was a fortress of corporate power. Beatrice had spared absolutely no expense in her scorched earth campaign. 4 elite litigators from Sterling and Vance sat in a row, their custom-tailored Italian suits projecting an aura of invincibility. They were actively arranging pristine, heavily indexed binders of fabricated evidence and whispering to one another with supreme confidence. Behind them, in the first row of the gallery, sat the Washington family, forming a unified, intimidating front of aristocratic entitlement. As I walked down the center aisle, Beatrice leaned forward. She did not bother to lower her voice. She wanted the entire courtroom to hear her absolute triumph. "Look at her," Beatrice scoffed, her voice dripping with venomous delight, echoing clearly in the quiet room. "She is so poor she cannot even hire a first-year intern to represent her. She actually thinks she can fight us by herself. It is pathetic, really. It is completely over." Beside her, Bryce let out a low, sharp bark of laughter. He leaned back, crossing his legs and resting his ankle on his knee, the very picture of a man who believed he had successfully rigged the entire system. He looked at me with a predatory, arrogant smirk, confident that his Cayman Islands trusts and forged Department of Defense contracts were safely insulated from this petty domestic squabble. He was the mastermind of the military supply fraud, but today he was just enjoying the show, watching his mother-in-law financially execute the woman who had dared to insult them. To his left, Marcus shifted in his seat, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at me with an expression of manufactured sorrow, shaking his handsome head slowly. He was playing the part of the reluctant victim, perfectly acting as though stripping me of my ancestral home was a tragic but necessary business decision. "Zora, you really should have just taken a settlement," Marcus called out, his voice hushed, but carrying a sickening tone of condescending pity. "You did not have to make it this ugly. We could have helped you get back on your feet." I did not flinch. I did not break my stride. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a single emotional reaction. I walked past the formidable wall of Sterling and Vance attorneys and took my seat at the empty defendant's table. The vast expanse of mahogany in front of me highlighted my total physical isolation. I placed my scuffed briefcase on the table and unlatched it. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the room, drawing the amused attention of the opposing counsel. The lead attorney for the Washington family, a silver-haired man with a shark-like smile, glanced over at me and chuckled quietly to his co-counsel. They were apex predators, observing a wounded gazelle that had inexplicably wandered into the lion's den. They had filed a mountain of aggressive motions demanding immediate seizure of my family's 400 acres of prime South Carolina coastal real estate. They had stacked the deck with fraudulent financial ledgers claiming my unhinged public behavior had caused Marcus irreparable economic harm. They fully expected me to beg for mercy or break down in tears the moment the judge ordered the asset forfeiture. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single thin manila folder. I placed it perfectly square in the center of the table. I extracted a yellow legal pad and a standard black pen, aligning them parallel to the edge of the wood with meticulous precision. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of anxiety. I sat back in my wooden chair, keeping my spine rigid and my hands folded loosely in my lap. I stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench, projecting an aura of absolute lethal calm. I could feel the Washington family's collective gaze burning into the back of my neck. Beatrice was practically vibrating with anticipation. She was envisioning the commercial developers bulldozing my great-grandfather's ancient oak trees. She was already calculating the profit margins from selling the bedrock of my family's heritage to cover her son's imaginary losses. She genuinely believed her immense wealth and her elite high-priced lawyers had bought her the ultimate unassailable victory. She had no idea that by forcing this civil hearing and filing those sworn financial affidavits in a federal court, she had voluntarily walked her entire family onto a live minefield. The heavy oak door adjacent to the judge's bench swung open with a sharp, definitive thud. The ambient chatter from the plaintiff's table died instantly. The courtroom bailiff stepped forward, his voice booming across the cavernous room, commanding immediate silence. All rise. The United States District Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Robert Sterling presiding. We all stood. From the corner of my eye, I saw the Sterling and Vance litigators button their jackets, standing at rigid professional attention. They expected a standard civil magistrate, someone who would be suitably impressed by their firm's prestigious name and easily swayed by their client's massive corporate wealth. They were expecting a judge they could manipulate with aggressive corporate litigation tactics and endless legal maneuvering. Instead, the heavy oak door swung fully open and Judge Robert Sterling stepped out of the shadows. He ascended the steps to the bench with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man accustomed to wielding absolute, unyielding authority. He was a towering, imposing black man with broad shoulders and a gaze that could cut through reinforced steel. He wore the traditional black judicial robe, but his rigid posture and the sharp, precise way he moved betrayed his heavily classified background. Before taking the federal bench, Judge Sterling had been one of the most ruthless and decorated military judges in the United States Judge Advocate General Corps. He was a legend in the intelligence community, infamous for prosecuting international war criminals, dismantling global smuggling rings, and sending corrupt generals to federal prison. He was a man who did not suffer fools, and he harbored a distinct lethal hatred for corporate parasites who defrauded the United States military. He reached the center of the high bench and looked down at the courtroom. His dark eyes swept slowly over the gallery, resting briefly on Beatrice's smug, expectant face and Bryce's relaxed, arrogant posture. He looked at the row of expensive elite lawyers standing at the plaintiff's table, their binders of forged evidence sitting openly in front of them. Then his gaze shifted to me, standing completely alone at the defense table in my cheap beige suit. There was no flash of recognition, no subtle nod. We were professionals executing a highly classified federal sting operation in broad daylight. He took his seat, the heavy wooden gavel resting near his right hand, and looked out over a family that had absolutely no idea they were already dead. The lead attorney from Sterling and Vance immediately sprang to his feet, smoothing the front of his custom-tailored suit. He possessed the polished theatrical confidence of a man who was used to bullying his way through the legal system. He approached the podium with a stack of heavily indexed binders, projecting an air of absolute superiority. He did not even bother to look in my direction. To him, I was not an opponent. I was simply a minor administrative hurdle to be cleared before lunchtime. "May it please the court, Your Honor," the attorney began, his voice booming with practiced indignation. "We are here today seeking an emergency injunction and immediate asset forfeiture against the defendant Zora Washington. My clients Marcus and Beatrice Washington have been subjected to a malicious, unhinged campaign of disruption by this woman. Over the past week, the defendant has exhibited deeply unstable behavior, culminating in a public spectacle that caused severe and entirely irreversible economic damage to Apex Holdings and its defense contracting subsidiaries." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded loosely in my lap. I watched Beatrice out of the corner of my eye. She was practically glowing. She leaned back against the polished wooden bench of the gallery, her chin raised in aristocratic defiance. She wore a tailored Chanel suit and a string of immaculate pearls, projecting the image of a long-suffering matriarch who was finally securing justice for her family. Next to her, Marcus hung his head slightly, performing the role of the heartbroken husband who had tried so hard to save his marriage to a volatile working-class woman. The attorney continued, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The defendant brought nothing into this marriage, Your Honor. She was a simple paralegal pulling a meager salary before my client graciously elevated her social standing. In return for his generosity, she has attempted to sabotage his corporate ventures. We have submitted sworn financial affidavits detailing the massive capital losses incurred by her actions. Because these losses occurred during the marriage, we are legally demanding immediate controlling interest in the defendant's sole tangible asset, a 400-acre parcel of coastal real estate in South Carolina, currently appraised at over $12 million. We ask that the court sign the seizure order immediately so my clients can liquidate the property and begin repairing the catastrophic financial harm they have suffered." The attorney offered Judge Sterling a crisp, professional nod and returned to the plaintiff's table. He sat down, pulling his suit jacket perfectly into place. His colleagues patted him on the back, offering quiet murmurs of congratulation. Bryce leaned forward from the gallery, whispering something into the attorney's ear and laughing a low, arrogant sound. They were already celebrating. They had painted a masterpiece of deceit, completely confident that their fabricated ledgers and elite pedigree would blind the court to the truth. The courtroom fell silent, waiting for the judge to rule. The silence stretched out second by agonizing second. The air in the room grew heavy and thick. Judge Sterling did not look at the plaintiff's table. He did not look at the stack of fraudulent affidavits the elite lawyers had so proudly presented. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes locked entirely on the thin manila folder I had placed in the exact center of my table. Slowly, with deliberate, terrifying precision, he reached out and picked up his heavy wooden gavel. The sharp, resounding crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block echoed through the room like a gunshot. The smug whispers at the plaintiff's table instantly ceased. Bryce's arrogant smile vanished. Beatrice stiffened, her posture suddenly rigid. Judge Sterling opened the manila folder. He spent exactly 10 seconds scanning the single page inside. It was not a legal brief. It was my unredacted Department of Defense operational deployment order stamped with the highest level of federal security clearance. Judge Sterling closed the folder. He folded his hands atop the polished mahogany bench and looked directly at me. His expression was solemn, completely devoid of the usual judicial detachment. It was the look of a veteran acknowledging a fellow soldier on a battlefield. "Good morning, Colonel Washington," Judge Sterling said, his deep voice carrying flawlessly across the dead silence of the courtroom. "It is truly surprising to see you here. A civil court seems entirely too small for a senior judge, advocate general prosecutor of your caliber." If a bomb had detonated in the center aisle, the physical impact could not have been more devastating. The camera in my mind tracked the shockwave as it hit Beatrice Washington's face. The blood drained from her immaculate features so fast her skin took on a sickening grayish hue. Her eyes widened to the point of tearing her perfectly structured aristocratic mask instantly dissolving into an expression of absolute primal terror. Her hands went slack. The heavy vintage crocodile leather handbag she was clutching slipped from her fingers. It hit the hard marble floor with a loud, heavy thud that sounded like a dropping guillotine blade. Next to her, Marcus actually stopped breathing. His handsome jaw dropped open, his mouth working silently as he tried to process a reality that fundamentally shattered his entire worldview. The submissive, poorly dressed paralegal he thought he had married. The quiet woman he had lectured on business strategy. The desperate charity case he believed he had rescued. She did not exist. She had never existed. But it was Bryce who truly understood the gravity of the situation. Bryce was the mastermind moving the offshore money and forging the military supply manifests. He knew exactly what the Judge Advocate General Corps was. He knew exactly what they did to corrupt defense contractors. The arrogant smirk melted off his pale face, replaced by sheer, visceral panic. He gripped the wooden railing in front of him, his knuckles turning stark white. Colonel Bryce choked out, his voice a ragged, terrified whisper that carried in the absolute silence. JAG. Damn it, she is just a paralegal. The four elite litigators from Sterling and Vance froze. Their professional confidence evaporated in a fraction of a second. The lead attorney who had just spent 10 minutes slandering me looked down at his binders of forged evidence and then up at Judge Sterling. The realization hit the legal team like a physical blow. They had just stood in a federal courtroom and presented entirely fabricated financial ledgers. They had legally sworn to the validity of fake corporate losses to justify stealing land. They had unknowingly entered fraudulent documents into the United States judicial system, all while attempting to extort an active duty federal prosecutor. They were not just going to lose their law licenses. They were going to federal prison. I did not look at the scrambling lawyers. I did not look at Marcus or Bryce. I stood up, pushing my wooden chair back with a slow, deliberate scrape that echoed loudly. I smoothed the front of my cheap beige suit, moving with the lethal, unhurried grace of a predator that had finally trapped its prey. I stepped out from behind the defense table, walking until I stood directly in front of the judge's bench. I turned my head very slowly, shifting my gaze away from Judge Sterling and locking my eyes directly onto Beatrice Washington. She was trembling violently. The powerful, untouchable matriarch of Atlanta society was shrinking into the wooden bench, looking at me as if I were the Grim Reaper himself. The illusion of her superiority was completely dead. I let the silence stretch out, allowing her to feel the crushing, inescapable weight of the trap closing around her throat. "Good morning, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, carrying the absolute authority of my rank. "I am not here today to finalize a divorce. I am not here to dispute a property division. I am here to file a federal countersuit for Department of Defense contract fraud, racketeering, and treason." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The words dropped into the cavernous courtroom with the weight of an anvil shattering the pristine illusion of the Washington dynasty. I opened the manila folder and slid a stack of heavily redacted military supply manifests across the polished mahogany of the judge's bench. Judge Sterling picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the highlighted sections with clinical precision. The silence in the gallery was absolute, broken only by the frantic, panicked whispering of the Sterling and Vance litigators, who were desperately trying to figure out how they had walked into a federal trap. For 5 years, my husband and his brother-in-law have operated under the guise of a legitimate minority-owned business. I stated, my gaze panning slowly from the bench to the plaintiff's table. They used my name, my social security number, and my honorable military service record as a prop to secure priority government defense contracts. They told the Department of Defense they were supplying sterile Pitocin bandages and life-saving trauma kits to our active-duty combat medics in classified combat zones. I turned to look directly at Bryce. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely bloodless. His arrogant posture had collapsed into a rigid, terrified crouch. "But Bryce Washington is not a patriot," I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air. He is a parasite. Instead of fulfilling those contracts with approved domestic manufacturers, he diverted the federal funds into his Cayman Islands accounts. He then purchased cheap, contaminated, counterfeit medical supplies from unverified, blacklisted laboratories in Shenzhen. He knowingly shipped infected trauma gear to frontline soldiers just to pad his own profit margins. Objection! The lead attorney shouted, springing to his feet, his voice cracking with uncharacteristic panic. Your Honor, this is an outrageous fabrication. My clients are respected members of the Atlanta business community. This woman is clearly suffering a psychotic break. Sit down, Counselor. Judge Sterling barked, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. The attorney flinched physically, recoiling as if he had been struck. He slowly sank back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of him. Judge Sterling turned his dark, penetrating gaze toward the plaintiff's table. The court is currently reviewing operational supply ledgers that completely corroborate the Colonel's statements. I suggest you advise your clients to remain perfectly silent unless they wish to add perjury to their rapidly expanding list of federal charges. I watched the color completely drain from Marcus's face. He looked at the documents on the judge's bench, then looked at me, his handsome features twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated cowardice. The realization that his entire lavish lifestyle was built on a foundation of treason had finally pierced his thick skull. He was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and the self-preservation instinct of a spoiled child instantly kicked in. I did not know. Marcus blurted out, his voice high and desperate. He stood up, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward. It hit the marble floor with a loud crack, but he ignored it, pointing a shaking finger directly at Bryce. I had nothing to do with the overseas manufacturing. Bryce handled the entire supply chain. He brought me the manifest and told me where to sign. He told me it was all above board. I am just the CEO on paper. He is the one who set up the offshore accounts. He did this. The absolute betrayal hung in the air, a pathetic display of a man throwing his own family under the bus to save his own skin. Bryce's head snapped toward Marcus, his pale face suddenly flushing with a violent, explosive rage. The polished country club facade shattered completely, revealing the vicious, entitled monster underneath. "Shut your mouth, you spineless idiot!" Bryce roared, his voice echoing violently off the courtroom walls. He lunged across the table, grabbing Marcus by the lapels of his expensive custom suit. "I built this entire empire for you. I spoon-fed you every single contract and paid for your pathetic, extravagant life. All you had to do was smile for the cameras and keep your submissive little wife on a tight leash. I told you to control your wife, you stupid son of a bitch." "Order in this court," Judge Sterling thundered, slamming his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block with enough force to crack the wood. "Federal marshals, secure that table immediately." 3 armed federal marshals materialized from the shadows of the courtroom, moving with swift, tactical precision. They seized Bryce by the shoulders, dragging him away from a terrified, hyperventilating Marcus and forcing him back into his chair. Bryce was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he glared at me with absolute murderous hatred. I simply stared back at him, my expression completely blank, letting him drown in the realization that his arrogance had engineered his own total destruction. The Washington family was tearing itself apart right in front of the judge, just as I had calculated. The rot at the core of their dynasty was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. Suddenly, a loud theatrical sob echoed from the gallery. Beatrice Washington had watched her empire crumble, her son turn into a coward, and her son-in-law morph into a violent criminal in the span of 5 minutes. She realized the aggressive legal tactics and the high-priced lawyers were entirely useless against a federal indictment. The predator had suddenly realized she was the prey, and she immediately resorted to the only weapon she had left. She threw herself forward, gripping the wooden railing of the gallery barrier. Tears streamed down her meticulously powdered cheeks, her voice trembling with manufactured devastation. "Your Honor," she cried out, playing the role of the frail, heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. "Please, you must listen to me. I had absolutely no idea this was happening. I am just a mother. A grieving, deceived mother. My son and my son-in-law hid this from me. I trusted them to manage the family business. I would never knowingly participate in anything illegal. I am a God-fearing woman. You have to believe me, I am a victim of their deception too. I looked down at the sobbing woman gripping the wooden railing. Her performance was a masterclass in manipulation, but I had come prepared to dismantle her entire reality. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black digital voice recorder. I placed it gently on the wooden edge of the defense table and pressed the play button. The audio had been digitally enhanced by the Federal Cyber Division, ensuring every syllable echoed with crystal clarity across the silent courtroom. The recording captured the unmistakable, perfectly enunciated voice of Beatrice Washington holding court in her pristine sunroom just 3 weeks ago. "Use the church's Global Missionary Fund," the recorded voice of Beatrice ordered, dripping with icy calculation. "Root Bryce's surplus capital through the sanctuary expansion accounts. The congregation will never ask to see the underlying ledgers. And as for Zora, we will freeze her out completely. Once Marcus drains their joint accounts, we file the injunction to seize that swampland her family owns. She is too weak to fight back. We will break her and take everything." The audio stopped. The profound silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The invisible camera lens of the entire courtroom seemed to instantly zoom in on Beatrice's face. Her flawless, powdered complexion turned the color of wet ash. The righteous, God-fearing matriarch facade she had spent decades cultivating evaporated in less than 30 seconds. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the gallery, seeking a single sympathetic face. She found none. The elite society friends she had strategically invited to witness my humiliation were now staring at her in absolute revulsion. The First Lady of the Country Club had just been exposed as the ruthless architect of a massive federal money laundering syndicate. Judge Sterling did not say a word. He simply raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down with a singular deafening strike that signaled the absolute end of the Washington dynasty. On that precise cue, the heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom burst completely open. A perfectly coordinated tactical wave of armed personnel flooded the center aisle. Men and women wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the sharp, stark insignia of the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division fanned out across the room. The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with a severe expression, marched directly past the gallery and approached the plaintiff's table. "Beatrice Washington, Marcus Washington, and Bryce Peterson, you are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, military contract fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." The agent announced, her voice cutting through the rising chaos. Federal marshals immediately moved in, pulling a shrieking Beatrice away from the wooden railing. Cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around her delicate wrists. She thrashed wildly, the pristine pearls snapping and scattering across the marble floor like hail. Marcus did not fight the agents. Instead, his legs gave out completely. He dropped to his knees right in the middle of the courtroom floor, crawling frantically toward me. His handsome face was contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered terror. He grabbed the hem of my cheap beige skirt, sobbing uncontrollably. "Zora, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Zora, you have to tell them I did not know. You have to save me. I am your husband. Please do not let them take me." I looked down at the man who had spent 5 years trying to erase my identity. I calmly stepped backward, pulling my skirt out of his desperate grasp. Over the escalating din of the courtroom, Beatrice's voice pierced the air. She was being dragged backward down the center aisle, her designer heels scraping against the floor. She screamed Marcus's name in pure, unhinged despair, watching helplessly as the federal agents hauled her golden child up from the floor and forced his hands behind his back. The Empire was dead. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, leaving the chaotic symphony of shattered egos behind me. The camera of my reality pulled back, following me in a smooth, continuous glide down the polished marble corridor and out through the towering glass exit of the Richard B. Russell Federal Building. The blinding brilliance of the midday Atlanta sun washed over me, warming the cool air. I stepped onto the concrete plaza, breathing in deeply. The heavy exhaust and concrete dust of the city smelled sweeter than the finest perfume. The weight of 5 years of calculated subjugation lifted from my shoulders completely. The legal and financial massacre that followed was absolute and merciless. The federal indictments fell like a rain of steel over the Washington family. Bryce Washington, the arrogant mastermind, was stripped of his offshore havens and convicted of high treason and military contract fraud. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, where his country club charm held absolutely no currency. Marcus, the cowardly figurehead, lost Apex Holdings in a matter of days. The federal asset forfeiture seized every corporate holding, every hidden bank account, and every luxury vehicle he owned. He was left completely bankrupt, a broken man serving a 10-year sentence in a medium security facility. But Beatrice suffered the most exquisite destruction of all. The federal government seized her pristine estate and drained her illicit trust funds to pay restitution to the Department of Defense. The elite society she had worshipped completely erased her from existence. The prestigious Jack and Jill Club revoked her lifetime membership overnight. Her beloved church, the very sanctuary she had used to launder Bryce's blood money, formally expelled her from the congregation to save its own public image. The proud, untouchable matriarch was reduced to a penniless ward of the state. She was forced to relocate into the exact same subsidized social housing units she had spent her entire life actively despising. The final act of our tragedy occurred exactly 2 months later. I was sitting at my desk in my new private office, reviewing a legitimate defense contract, when my secure line rang. The caller ID indicated the Fulton County Detention Center. I hit the button to accept the collect call. "Zora, please," Beatrice sobbed through the crackling prison line, her voice stripped of all its former aristocratic velvet. It was the raw, pathetic wail of a broken, terrified woman. "Please, you have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left. The food here is rotten. The other women are animals. They took my pearls, Zora. I am begging you, show some mercy. We are family. We are—" I leaned back in my leather chair, listening to her desperate, ragged breathing. I thought about the years of quiet humiliation, the constant sneers over holiday dinners, the deliberate attempts to erase my identity, and the final absolute betrayal she had engineered with a smile on her face. I kept my voice perfectly flat, completely devoid of the emotion she so desperately craved. "I learned how to treat family by watching you," I said. "Goodbye, Beatrice." I pressed the button terminating the connection and set the phone down on my pristine desk. The sharp metallic echo of the federal handcuffs snapping shut faded away, replaced by the gentle clink of ice against crystal. The memory of their absolute destruction dissolved as I brought myself back to the present moment. I stood completely still, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my penthouse office. The sprawling, glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta stretched out beneath me, an ocean of neon and steel that I now commanded from the top floor of the city's most prestigious law firm. The aftermath of that day in federal court had been swift and merciless. My family's 400 acres of pristine South Carolina coastline remained securely in my name, forever protected from commercial bulldozers and greedy developers. But I did not stop at merely defending my heritage. The millions of dollars in federal restitution seized from Beatrice's liquidated estate and Marcus's seized corporate accounts did not simply sit in a government vault. I petitioned the federal magistrate to redirect every single cent of their illicit wealth into my great-grandfather's ancestral trust. I used their blood money to fully endow a massive scholarship fund for historically black colleges and universities, specifically designed to provide full tuition for the children of disabled and fallen military veterans. I turned the Washington family's sickening greed into a permanent engine for generational uplift and education. I was no longer hiding behind the unassuming facade of a subservient paralegal running errands for men who possessed half my intellect. The senior JAG prosecutor, who had dismantled an entire criminal syndicate in a single afternoon, was highly sought after. I accepted a position as a senior partner, and my name was now etched in heavy brass letters on the wall downstairs. My legal division specializes exclusively in military defense and federal whistleblower protection. I spend my days relentlessly dismantling corrupt defense contractors, protecting vulnerable service members, and destroying arrogant corporate elites using the exact same tactical precision that sent my former in-laws to federal prison. I raised the heavy crystal tumbler of aged bourbon to my lips, taking a slow, measured sip. The amber liquid burned pleasantly against my throat, a sharp, satisfying reminder of the victory I had orchestrated with absolute patience. I turned away from the sprawling city lights and looked directly forward, the faint reflection of my face visible in the darkened glass. They genuinely believed my silence was the pathetic endurance of a weak, helpless woman. I said, my voice steady and cold in the quiet room. They mistook my quiet observation for surrender and my patience for cowardice. But they did not understand the most fundamental rule of combat. In the military, when the battlefield grows completely silent, it does not mean the enemy has retreated. It means the sniper has finally locked onto the target. I smiled, a slow, razor-sharp expression that held absolutely no warmth. And I never miss. Fade to black.